this Ramadan.
You are listening to News and Views on Salam Media with me, your guest host for today and tomorrow, Abdullah Mwaswas. Remember, of course, you are always invited, dear listener, to join us on the show, to join our conversation by contacting us on the studio line 011 or reaching us on WhatsApp on 061 Of course, you can tweet at us on X at Salam Media using the hashtag Ramadan 2026 SM. And of course, we are streaming live on Facebook, as always, facebook.com/Salam Media, and on the Salam Media website, salammedia.com/listen dash live. And we are really privileged and honored this morning, actually, to be joined by a very distinguished guest, the renowned human rights lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith. Good morning, Clive. How are you?
Good morning, Dr. Abdullah. How are you? I'm well, and yourself?
Yes, I'm also doing very well. I mean, given the circumstances of the world we're living in at the
The
moment,
world is mad. The world is mad.
it
Yeah.
absolutely is. Thank you for joining us, of course, very early in the UK, I imagine, um, and probably a very cold day as well. I would probably imagine as
Oh,
well.
it's not too bad, and believe me, I've got my first cup of coffee. So I'm all right. I'm sorry about
Wonderful.
you guys in Ramadan. You're probably not having.
No, I mean it's admittedly it is difficult to be functioning this early in the morning without caffeine, but we plod on. It's part of our struggle and part of our attempt to be patient and steadfast, throughout the holy month.
Right.
But putting small talk aside, um, over the course of the the war that I guess has emerged over the last couple of weeks, your prime minister over there in the UK, Keir Starmer, of course, kind of started out as being somewhat supportive of US ambitions. He had allowed the US to use British bases in the region to attack Iran. And then an hour later, of course, the runway at the Royal Air Force Akrotiri base in Cyprus was struck by a one-way drone, which are designed, of course, to detonate on impact for our listeners who aren't aware. He's since attempted to distance himself from supporting the U.S. And Israel in this war. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, I don't think it was even as reasonable as you suggest. Keir Starmer initially did what he should have done as a former human rights lawyer and say that this whole war was mad. Then Donald Trump had a little tiff and said that the British weren't behaving, and Keir Starmer was no Winston Churchill. So at that point, Starmer tried to row back and pretend he was being friendly on the war thing. And then most recently, Trump, having finally and belatedly learned the limits of American power, I don't think he's learned it yet, was trying to get European governments to intervene with military help in the Straits of Hormuz, and the whole of Europe has said no. So that's where we are. It is, for goodness sake, we've had this over and over, and I always like to say the only lesson from history that we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But this isn't even history. This is current events we're not learning from. And you look back at Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, all these different interventions that have been made in the region recently, and they've all ended in tears, and it's just been terrible. And I suppose in the end, Dr. Abdullah, I always resort to the Michael Franti's song, which is "You can bomb the world to pieces, but you can't bomb it into peace." And it's just not a solution for anything, really.
Absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned that it seems that we're not learning the lessons from the present, not just from history. I mean, I'm I may look very young, of course, on camera, but I am old enough to remember the start of the Iraq War.
Well,
And the
my son thinks I'm old enough to remember, the Middle Ages. So you're doing better than me.
Yeah, and I mean, there is this like really wide pattern, of course, of the erosion of civil rights that goes back to the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, and of course, in a very accelerated way as well, the genocide in Palestine right now. The European Legal Support Center recently released these two databases about suppression of pro-Palestine speech in Germany, and I think more recently in the UK. And the numbers, of course, are shocking. Um, but there does seem to be, this direct relationship between these, we would really call them almost, imperialist excesses, these big wars and genocides, and the erosion of civil rights as part of the global war on terror, and its sort of two components, right? The military one, and then of course the kind of legalistic one, with things like the Patriot Act in the US, and these new interpretations and additions to the UK's Terrorism Act. But what would you kind of explain to us as being the connection between these big kind of imperial wars and genocides, and of course civil rights back at home?
Well, they are imperial and they are genocidal, and none of them are for any sort of good reason. We falsify the reasons. Going way back to 9/11, we said that the reason for the invasion of Afghanistan, was 9/11, but there were no Afghans involved in 9/11. We should have been invading Saudi Arabia if we were concerned with the people who actually took part in 9/11. And so these things, I think, are rooted in a madness, and they're rooted in a right-wing populism that says we can solve all of the world's problems with these very simplistic things. And you can go as far as the death penalty. America says we've got a terrible crime problem internally. So how do we solve it? Do we address the root causes? Do we address the fact that there is no healthcare, there's no welfare, there's drugs everywhere, there are too many guns, all of which complicated issues? Or do we just say to the American people, we'll execute a few black people and that'll solve the problem? With the war of terror, we put a bunch of Muslim men in Guantanamo Bay and said that solved the problem. Of course, it did exactly the opposite. And so every time that they're trying to say that these actions actually solve a world problem, they've got to come up with some cover-up system, because otherwise the world just gets to see what nonsense it is. And so with Gaza, for example, and you touch on Palestine action and the British response to that. Keir Starmer, who was a human rights lawyer who defended people in 2003 by saying it may be illegal to go set fire to US bombers at RAF Fairford. It may be illegal, but it's the moral thing to do to stop these wars. Turns around and says to a bunch of people I know who just sat outside Parliament with a little sign saying, I support Palestine action, I oppose genocide, arrest them all and threatens them all with prison. And the irony, the great thing about the British, at least, is they do have a sense of irony. There was a chap at that demonstration, and I was just talking about this yesterday, who had a sign saying, I support genocide, I oppose Palestine action. And, that was just taking the mickey out of this whole crazy system of trying to lock people up for just supporting an end to the war in Gaza. And the British wouldn't arrest someone who's saying, I support genocide. They would arrest someone who says, I oppose genocide. And all of this is just a way to make it look like we're achieving something, to make it look like we're keeping immigrants out of our country when we go around trying to take over other people's countries. It's very, very sad. It's part of a long pattern in history, and it's part of a long pattern that we have to rebut. And the way to rebut it is not just to say Donald Trump is mad or to say that Keir Starmer is a hypocrite. We have to offer a positive alternative, and it's very, very possible to do. I mean, what you talk about over Ramadan, I'm sure, is positive things about Islam. You don't go around just talking about how everyone's Islamophobic. You've got to offer the positive aspects. And there are many, many positive things about Islam, of course. At the same time, we have to offer positive alternatives to people to inspire them to do decent acts rather than to inspire them just to hate a bunch of Muslims and say that Iran is the cause of all of our trouble when it patently isn't.
Hmm. Absolutely, and I mean there is a very long history, particularly in Britain, of kind of blaming a lot of problems on Muslims, going back probably even to the Crusades,
Mm.
which we actually discussed, at the start of Ramadan on this show in quite a bit of depth, for those that want to kind of go back and listen to that. But just before I let you go, I mean, you mentioned as well, the opening up of Guantanamo Bay, and kind of putting a bunch of Muslim men in there and saying, okay, we've dealt with terrorism. You have a long history, as I know, of working with Guantanamo Bay detainees. Many of them, are detained on very questionable legal grounds. Like I'm thinking, for example, of Ahmed Rabbani, who spent 18 years in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, as you know better than I do, the famous, well, I guess not so famous, but well-known Pakistani taxi driver and chef, who
Who,
spent
let's
18.
face it, Dr. Abdullah, puts you to shame. We're complaining about not having any food in Ramadan. Ahmed Rabbani went on hunger strike against the injustice of his detention for 7 years. He went
Mhm,
without taking food, and the Americans force-fed him, of course. But
mhm.
really, for anyone who's feeling that they want their breakfast during Ramadan,
I
think
mean,
about
absolutely.
them.
I mean, there is a misconception that, in Ramadan we're meant to fast, to kind of show solidarity with the poor, but actually we're meant to fast because Allah ordered us to fast. The poor also have to fast as well, whether they have food or not.
Mm.
Um, and so, no, I'm glad you bring that up. And of course, just to kind of really, put it to the listener, like Ahmed Rabbani, of course, served 18 years without charge or trial. And he was subject to enhanced interrogation methods, which, are a euphemism, as we all know, for torture. What's the current status of the prison? We don't really hear about it anymore in the news. So what's going on there? I know that there was at some point talk about ICE, using it as a facility. But what's happening now?
Well, there's only 15 people there, and it is an amazing success story. It's an amazing success story that's not talked about enough because back in 2002, February the 19th, 2002, we sued to get rid of Guantanamo at the very beginning. And we sued the most powerful person on the planet, who was then George W. Bush. And we've won. And of the 780 prisoners there, 765 have gone, there are 15 left. We'll get some of the rest out very soon. And these are the people who were the most hated in the world by the US, because it does include just a very tiny group of folk like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who were notoriously behind 9/11. And normally the Americans would like to execute them without much ado. They've not managed to punish them at all yet, except obviously by holding them in that awful prison. But the overwhelming majority of people in Guantanamo, the 98% of the people who were detained by the United States, we have proven to be innocent, like Ahmed Rabbani, like so many. I've had 87 people I've represented myself there. And what this shows are two things. One is the entirety of it was a big lie. The notion that we were locking up the worst of the worst terrorists in the world was just a big lie, just like a lot of these other things. But rather more importantly than that, we have shown very clearly that they were all innocent, and we've got them back home with their families. And I do think, I mean, this is why I love to do what I get to do, because I get to take someone like Ahmed and basically give him his life back. It's not perfect, it's not ideal. The poor chap's suffered horrendous torture and never gets even an apology from the United States, which is why I, as an American, actually go around the world apologizing, because I figure you've got to get it from someone, and I'm probably the only one you will get it from. But at least we've beaten that back. And then there's so many of my former clients in Guantanamo who, instead of being bitter, instead of being hateful, are using that as a platform for human rights. Omar Degayas, one of my favorite clients from Libya, and well, he's a British resident too, said to me he wouldn't change a single thing that happened to him. He was grateful to the Americans for doing what they did, because it allowed him to have a platform on which to speak about injustice and justice and and to inspire people. And I think that's a fabulous attitude, and that's the attitude we've got to take. We've got to do a lot less of the hatred and warmongering that Trump does, and a lot more of finding the decency in other people and getting along, because that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Clive. And that's a beautiful note to end on. Of course, when you talk about, on one hand, offering a positive alternative, but also to demonstrate that, in the face of the biggest imperial power on the earth, there can be victory against that.
Mm.
In kind of the actions that you and your team and others have taken against, what's been happening at Guantanamo Bay. And hopefully we pray for the release of any remaining innocents who are still there, and not just pray for their release, but be active to contribute to
Yeah.
campaigns for that. And so, thank you very much for giving us that really great note to end this interview on. It's been an absolute pleasure, Clive. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks.
All right. I hope you will have a good rest of the day. That was Clive Stafford Smith joining us from the UK, renowned human rights lawyer over there. And so we will go to another break, after which we'll be joined by our final guest for today for another very interesting, fascinating, and thrilling discussion, I'm sure. So stay with us, dear listener. We'll be back very soon.